My father announced to relatives that I died in an accident and held a funeral with a coffin. He wanted to show how they would grieve without me. I found out about this from my neighbor. So this happened about 3 weeks ago and I'm still processing everything. I'm 25 and work remotely, which means I spend most of my time in my apartment in Louisville. I've always been what you'd call independent, maybe too independent according to my family. I moved out when I was 18 for college and never really looked back. My relationship with my parents has been complicated ever since. The thing is, I don't call home much. Maybe once every few months, and even then it's usually because my mom texts me first. I know this bothers my dad especially. He's always been the type who expects regular check-ins, Sunday dinners, all that traditional family stuff that I just never really felt drawn to. After college, I got caught up in my work and my own life, and honestly, I didn't miss the constant questions about when I'm getting married, when I'm having kids, why I don't visit more often. My parents live about 40 minutes away in this small town where everyone knows everyone's business. I grew up there and couldn't wait to leave. They still live in the same house, still go to the same church, still have the same group of friends they've had for decades. It's not a bad life, it's just not mine. About 2 months ago, my dad called me, and we had what I thought was just another one of our typical conversations that always somehow turned into an argument. He was going on about how I never make time for family, how I act like I'm too good for them now, how ungrateful I am after everything they've done for me. I got defensive, which I always do, and told him I'm just busy with work and my own life. The conversation ended with him saying something about how I'd regret taking my family for granted someday. I didn't think much of it at the time. We'd had similar fights before, and things would usually cool down after a few weeks. But this time felt different somehow. There was something in his voice that was more hurt than angry, but I was too stubborn to reach out first. Then last Tuesday, my neighbor knocked on my door around 7 in the evening. She's this sweet older lady who lives across the hall, and we chat sometimes when we're getting our mail. She looked really uncomfortable and asked if she could come in for a minute. She sat down on my couch and just stared at me for a long moment before asking if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just tired from work, and asked why she was asking. That's when she pulled out her phone and showed me a Facebook post. It was from my aunt's account, and the first thing I saw was a picture of a flower arrangement with the caption talking about how heartbroken the family was over my sudden passing. I stared at the screen thinking there had to be some mistake. Maybe someone with the same name had died and my aunt got confused. But then I kept scrolling and saw more posts. My cousins sharing memories of me in past tense. My mom's sister posting about how tragic it was that someone so young was taken so suddenly in such a terrible accident. My neighbor was watching my face the whole time and could see I was completely confused. She told me she'd seen the posts earlier that day and had been worried sick, especially since she'd seen me just that morning getting my mail like always. She said she almost called the police before deciding to just knock on my door first. I grabbed my phone and started checking my own social media. There were dozens of messages from people I hadn't talked to in years, offering condolences and sharing memories. My high school friends, old coworkers, even people I barely knew were posting on my timeline about how sorry they were for my family's loss. The really weird part was that none of my immediate family had posted anything. Not my parents, not my brother, none of them. But extended family, family friends, people from my parents' church, they were all talking about my death like it was real. I called my mom immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Same with my dad and my brother. I started to panic, thinking maybe something terrible had actually happened to them. Maybe there really had been an accident and somehow I was getting blamed for it or something equally crazy. My neighbor stayed with me while I tried to figure out what was happening. We spent the next hour going through social media posts, trying to piece together the story. From what we could gather, the word being spread was that I had died in a car accident 3 days earlier. People were talking about how sudden and tragic it was, how I was so young, how my poor parents were devastated. But here's the thing that really got to me. Some of the posts were talking about funeral arrangements. My aunt had shared details about a service that was apparently happening the next day at my parents' church. She posted about how the family was requesting donations to a charity in my memory instead of flowers. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking there had to be some reasonable explanation. Maybe my parents were in some kind of trouble and this was their way of hiding from something. Maybe they were trying to protect me from some danger I didn't know about. I came up with dozens of theories, each one more far-fetched than the last. The next morning, I decided I had to drive to my hometown and figure out what was going on. I took the day off work and made the 40-minute drive feeling like I was in some kind of weird dream. The whole way there, I kept expecting my phone to ring with my mom calling to explain everything. When I got to my parents' street, I parked a few blocks away and walked. I know this sounds paranoid, but I wanted to see what was happening at their house before I just showed up. There were cars everywhere. The driveway was full, and people were parked all along the street. I recognized some of the vehicles: my uncle's truck, my cousin's red car, my aunt's minivan. I walked closer and could see people in dark clothes going in and out of the house. Everyone looked somber and sad, the way people do at actual funerals. I saw my mom's best friend carrying a casserole dish inside, and my dad's brother was smoking a cigarette on the front porch with tears in his eyes. That's when it hit me that this was all real. Not my death, obviously, but the fact that all these people genuinely believed I was dead. They were grieving for me. They were taking time out of their lives to come support my parents through what they thought was the worst tragedy imaginable. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just walk up to the front door and end this whole thing, but another part of me was terrified of what I might find out. Why would my parents do this? What could possibly be worth putting our entire extended family through this kind of pain? I ended up sitting in my car for almost 2 hours, just watching people come and go. I saw relatives I hadn't seen in years, all looking devastated. My cousin, who I used to be really close to as kids, was crying so hard she could barely walk. My grandmother, who's in her 80s, was being helped up the front steps by 2 of my uncles, and she looked like she'd aged 10 years. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I called my mom's cell phone again, and this time she answered. I could hear voices and movement in the background, and she sounded exhausted. I didn't even say hello. I just asked her what was going on and why everyone thought I was dead. There was this long silence, and then I heard her telling someone she needed to take this call in private. I heard a door close and then she started crying. She told me that my dad had been so hurt by our last conversation, and by what he saw as my complete disregard for family, that he decided to show everyone what life would be like without me. He'd called all the relatives and told them I'd been killed in a car accident. He said he wanted them to see how much I actually meant to them, and he wanted me to see how much I meant to them too. I asked her how she could go along with something like this, and she said she'd tried to talk him out of it, but once he'd made the calls, she didn't know how to stop it. She said he was convinced that this would finally make me understand how important family is, and that I'd be grateful for the wake-up call. The funeral service was supposed to be that afternoon. They'd rented a casket and everything. My dad had apparently told everyone that my body had been too damaged in the accident for an open casket service, so they were having a closed casket funeral with just family and close friends. My mom begged me not to show up at the church. She said it would be too traumatic for everyone, especially my grandmother, and that we needed to figure out a way to handle this that wouldn't give anyone a heart attack. She promised she'd work on my dad and try to get him to call off the service, but she wasn't sure she could convince him. I hung up feeling more confused and hurt than I'd ever felt in my life. My own father had essentially killed me off to prove a point. He'd put our entire family through the worst kind of grief just to teach me a lesson about staying in touch more often. But what really got to me was thinking about all those people at the house. My grandmother crying for a granddaughter she thought she'd lost. My cousins sharing memories and supporting each other through what they believed was a tragedy. These people genuinely loved me, and they were in real pain because of my dad's manipulation. I drove home and spent the rest of the day in a complete daze. I kept getting more messages from people who'd heard about my supposed death. Old friends were sharing stories about me, saying how much they'd miss me, how sorry they were that we'd lost touch. It was like reading my own obituary, except I was alive to see how people really felt about me. That evening my brother finally called me. He was furious. Apparently, my mom had told him the truth after I called, and he'd confronted my dad about the whole thing. My brother said Dad was still planning to go through with the funeral service, claiming that since it had gone this far, he might as well follow through and make sure I learned my lesson. My brother told me he was going to tell everyone the truth before the service, but I asked him to wait. I said I needed to think about how to handle this, and I didn't want my grandmother or some of the older relatives to find out in a way that might be too shocking. Update 1. I posted this story a few days ago and got a lot of responses. Some people thought I should just show up at the funeral, others said I should call the police, and some suggested I should go no contact with my dad permanently. I appreciate all the advice, even though some of the comments were pretty harsh about my family situation. I wanted to update everyone on what happened, because things got even more complicated than I expected. So after my brother called me, I decided I couldn't let the funeral actually happen. The thought of my grandmother and all my relatives sitting in that church grieving over an empty casket was just too much. But I also didn't want to just show up and traumatize everyone. I ended up calling my aunt, my mom's sister, who had been posting about my death on Facebook. I figured she'd be able to help me figure out the best way to handle this without giving anyone a heart attack or causing too much chaos. When she answered the phone, there was this long silence after I said hello. Then she started crying and saying my name over and over. I had to keep reassuring her that yes, it was really me, and yes, I was alive and okay. She was so confused and asked me how I was calling her if I was dead. I explained everything, about how my dad had made up the whole story about the car accident, about how this was all some twisted lesson he was trying to teach me. My aunt got quiet for a really long time and then she got angry. Like really angry. She started saying things about my dad that I can't repeat here, but basically she was furious that he'd put the entire family through this. She told me that my grandmother had been inconsolable since hearing the news. She hadn't eaten in 2 days and had been talking about how she wished she'd called me more often, how she regretted not being a better grandmother. My aunt said she'd never seen my grandmother so broken, and that several of the older relatives were talking about how this tragedy had made them realize they needed to reach out to their own estranged family members before it was too late. That's when I realized how much damage my dad's stunt had actually caused. It wasn't just about teaching me a lesson anymore. He genuinely traumatized people who loved me. My aunt told me that my cousin had called in sick to work for 3 days because she was too upset to function. Another relative had driven 8 hours from out of state to be at the funeral. My aunt and I came up with a plan. She would call the most important family members individually and explain that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that I was alive and well, and that the funeral was being canceled. She said she'd handle my grandmother personally, and make sure she had someone with her when she found out. But she also told me something that made me even more angry at my dad. Apparently, he'd been recording some of the conversations with grieving relatives. My aunt had seen him with his phone out during some of the emotional moments, and when she asked him about it, he said he was documenting everything so he could show me later how much people really cared about me. The thought of my dad filming my grandmother's grief to use as some kind of twisted evidence in his argument with me made me sick. This wasn't just a misguided attempt to bring the family closer together. This was cruel and manipulative in a way I'd never seen from him before. My aunt started making calls that evening, and I could hear the shock and confusion in people's voices even through her phone. Some relatives were relieved, others were angry, and a few were so confused they thought there was some mistake and that maybe I really was dead and my aunt was in denial. The hardest part was when she called my grandmother. I could hear my grandmother crying through the phone, but this time it was different. She was crying from relief and joy, but also from anger and confusion. She kept asking why someone would do something so cruel, and my aunt had to keep explaining that it was complicated family drama that had gotten out of hand. By the end of the night, most of the important relatives knew the truth. The funeral was officially canceled, though my aunt said some people were still planning to come by my parents' house the next day to demand an explanation from my dad. I decided I needed to confront my dad directly. I drove back to my hometown the next morning, but this time I went straight to the house. There were still a few cars in the driveway, relatives who'd driven in from out of town and were staying with my parents. When I walked up to the front door, I could hear voices inside. It sounded like people were arguing. I knocked and the voices stopped immediately. My mom answered the door, and the look on her face was like she'd seen a ghost, which I guess in a way she had. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and she was crying and apologizing over and over. Behind her I could see several relatives standing in the living room, all staring at me like they couldn't believe I was real. My grandmother was sitting on the couch, and when she saw me, she just held out her arms. I went over and hugged her, and she held on to me like she was afraid I might disappear again. She kept touching my face and my hands like she needed physical proof that I was really there. But my dad wasn't in the room. My mom told me he was in the garage, and that he'd been out there most of the morning avoiding the relatives who were demanding answers. She said he knew I was coming and that he was embarrassed about the whole thing. I found him in the garage, sitting on an old lawn chair and staring at his phone. When he saw me, he looked up but didn't say anything. I asked him why he did it, and he just sat there for a long time before answering. He said he'd been hurt by our last conversation, and by what he saw as my complete rejection of the family. He said he'd gotten the idea when he was talking to his brother about how kids these days don't appreciate their families until it's too late. He thought that if everyone could see how much they'd miss me, and if I could see how much they'd miss me, maybe we could all start over and be closer. I asked him about the recording, and he looked genuinely ashamed for the first time. He admitted he'd been filming some of the reactions because he thought I wouldn't believe him if he just told me about it later. He said he wanted proof of how much people cared about me. The conversation was hard because part of me could see that in his twisted way. He thought he was doing something good. But the other part of me was furious that he'd put my grandmother and everyone else through real grief just to prove a point to me. I told him that his stunt had backfired completely. Instead of bringing the family closer together, he traumatized people and created a mess that would probably take months to fully clean up. I said that if he wanted me to be more involved with the family, pretending I was dead was probably the worst possible way to go about it. He apologized, but it felt hollow. Like he was sorry he got caught and that things went too far, but not necessarily sorry for the initial idea. He kept saying he just wanted his daughter back, and he didn't know what else to do to get my attention. Update 2. It's been about 2 weeks since my last update, and I wanted to share what's happened since then because the situation has continued to evolve in ways I didn't expect. After confronting my dad in the garage, I spent the rest of that day talking with various relatives who were still at the house. Everyone was dealing with the aftermath differently. Some were angry at my dad, some were just relieved I was okay, and others seemed more focused on the family drama than anything else. My grandmother pulled me aside and told me something that really stuck with me. She said that even though finding out I was alive was the best news she'd gotten in years, the whole experience had made her realize how much she'd been taking our relationship for granted too. She said she'd spent those 2 days thinking about all the times she could have called me but didn't, all the ways she could have been a better grandmother. That conversation made me realize that while my dad's method was completely wrong and hurtful, there was some truth buried in his twisted logic. Not the part about me being ungrateful or needing to be taught a lesson, but the part about all of us taking each other for granted. I ended up staying in town for a few extra days, partly because I didn't want to leave my grandmother right after everything that had happened, and partly because I needed time to process everything. I stayed at my parents' house, which was awkward but necessary. My dad and I didn't talk much during those first few days. He seemed to be avoiding me, which was probably for the best since I was still pretty angry. But my mom and I had some long conversations that helped me understand how things had gotten to this point. She told me that my dad had been struggling with empty nest syndrome much more than I'd realized. She said he'd been talking for months about how he felt like he'd lost both his kids. My brother had moved across the country for work, and I basically disappeared into my own life. She said he'd been feeling useless and forgotten, like he'd failed as a father. This didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped me understand where it was coming from. My dad had always been the type to express love through actions rather than words, and in his mind he'd been doing something loving by trying to bring the family back together. The fact that his actions were manipulative and hurtful seemed to be something he genuinely hadn't fully considered. On my 3rd day there, something unexpected happened. My dad's brother came by the house and asked to speak with both of us. He'd been one of the relatives who'd been most upset about the whole fake death thing, and I thought he was coming to yell at my dad some more. Instead, he sat us both down and told us that he'd been thinking about his own relationship with his kids. He said that watching everyone's reaction to my supposed death had made him realize that he'd been making some of the same mistakes my dad had been making, expecting his kids to just naturally stay close without putting in the effort himself. He said he'd called his daughter for the first time in 6 months after hearing about my death, and they'd had the best conversation they'd had in years. He told my dad that while his method was completely wrong, the wake-up call had actually helped some people in the family realize they needed to work harder on their relationships. This led to a really long, difficult conversation between me and my dad. We talked about how we'd both contributed to the distance between us. I admitted that I had been avoiding family contact partly because I was tired of feeling judged and criticized. He admitted that he'd been critical because he was scared of losing me entirely. We talked about how different our communication styles were. I needed space to feel loved, and he needed regular contact to feel loved. Neither of us had been willing to compromise or try to understand the other's perspective. It wasn't a magical healing moment or anything like that. We both said things that hurt, and there were moments when I thought the conversation was going to turn into another fight. But by the end, we'd at least established that we both wanted to have a relationship, and we were both willing to work on it. We came up with some basic ground rules. I agreed to call home at least once a month and to visit for at least one holiday per year. He agreed to stop criticizing my life choices and to ask about my interests rather than just focusing on what I wasn't doing. We also agreed that if either of us felt like the other was falling back into old patterns, we'd address it directly instead of letting resentment build up. The hardest part of all this has been dealing with the extended family fallout. Some relatives are still angry about the whole thing and think my dad should face some kind of consequences. Others seem to think it's all water under the bridge now that everyone knows I'm alive. My aunt has been amazing through all of this. She's been fielding calls from confused relatives and helping to manage the social media cleanup. Apparently, there are still some people who haven't gotten the message that I'm alive, and she's been tracking down all the posts and comments to make sure everyone knows the truth. The weirdest part has been seeing how the fake death affected people outside our immediate family. Several of my high school friends reached out after hearing I was alive, and we've been reconnecting in ways that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. Some of them said that hearing about my supposed death made them realize they wanted to maintain friendships better. One of my former coworkers even called me and said that the whole situation had inspired her to reach out to her own estranged family members. So in some bizarre way, my dad's twisted plan actually did bring people together, just not in the way he intended, and not without causing a lot of unnecessary pain first. Final update. It's been about 6 weeks since this whole situation started, and I wanted to give one final update since so many people have been following this story and asking for resolution. The biggest change is in my relationship with my dad. We've been talking on the phone every couple of weeks, which is more than we'd talked in the previous 2 years combined. The conversations are still sometimes awkward, but they're getting easier. He's been making a real effort to ask about my life without being judgmental, and I've been making an effort to share more than just the bare minimum. Last weekend, I drove home from my grandmother's birthday party. It was the first family gathering since the fake funeral incident, and I wasn't sure how it would go, but it actually ended up being really nice. My grandmother was so happy to see me, and several relatives mentioned how good it was to have me there. My dad and I even had a moment during the party where he pulled me aside and thanked me for giving him another chance. He said he knew he'd handled everything wrong, but that he was grateful the whole mess had led to us talking again. He also said he'd deleted all the recordings he'd made, which was something I'd been worried about. The relationship with my mom has improved too. I think she'd been caught in the middle of the tension between me and my dad for years, and now that we're communicating better, she feels more comfortable reaching out to me as well. She's been sending me pictures of their garden and updates about neighbors. I used to know little things that help me feel more connected to home without feeling suffocated. My brother flew back for the birthday party, which was the first time we'd all been together since the fake funeral situation. He and I talked about how we'd both been guilty of leaving our parents behind as we built our adult lives. He's been making more effort to stay in touch too, which has taken some of the pressure off me to be the only connection between my parents and their kids. The extended family situation has mostly settled down. There are still a few relatives who bring up the fake funeral thing occasionally, usually as a cautionary tale about family communication, but most people seem ready to move on. My aunt said she thinks the whole experience actually brought some family members closer together, which is ironic considering how it started. I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness through all of this. What my dad did was wrong, and it caused real harm to people who didn't deserve it. But I also came to understand that he was acting out of his own pain and desperation. That doesn't excuse his actions, but it helps explain them. I think the thing that helped me forgive him was seeing how genuinely remorseful he became once he understood the full impact of what he'd done. It took him a while to get there. At first he was more defensive than apologetic. But watching him apologize to my grandmother and other relatives, seeing him take responsibility for the hurt he'd caused, that showed me he was capable of growth and change. The work situation has been interesting too. I ended up telling my boss about the whole situation because I'd taken several days off and needed to explain why. She was shocked but also said it made her think about her own family relationships. She's actually implemented a new policy allowing employees to take mental health days for family issues, partly inspired by what I went through. I've also been more intentional about maintaining friendships. The experience of seeing how people reacted to my supposed death made me realize I've been taking a lot of relationships for granted. I've been reaching out to old friends, accepting invitations I might have declined before, and generally trying to be more present in people's lives. Looking back, I can honestly say that despite how horrible and traumatic the whole experience was, some good did come out of it. Not because my dad's plan worked the way he intended, but because it forced all of us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our relationships and communication patterns. I learned that I had been more closed off than I realized, and that my need for independence had sometimes crossed into neglect of important relationships. My dad learned that manipulation and control aren't effective ways to show love, and that he needed to respect my autonomy while still maintaining connection. The whole family learned that we'd been making assumptions about each other's feelings and motivations instead of actually communicating. We'd all been waiting for other people to make the first move to show more interest to prove they cared more. I still think what my dad did was terrible and wrong. I wouldn't recommend anyone try to teach their family members lessons by faking their own death or anyone else's death. The trauma it caused was real, and it could have gone much worse than it did. But I also think there's something to be said for the way we were all able to work through it afterward. Instead of letting the incident destroy our family, we used it as an opportunity to have conversations we'd been avoiding for years. We addressed patterns of behavior that weren't working for anyone, and we committed to doing better. The monthly phone calls with my parents have become something I actually look forward to. My dad shares stories about his work and asks genuine questions about mine. My mom updates me on family news and neighborhood gossip that I find myself caring about more than I expected. These calls feel natural now, not obligatory. I'm planning to spend Christmas with them this year, which will be the first time in 4 years. I'm actually excited about it, which surprises me. I think knowing that I have clearer boundaries and better communication with them makes the idea of extended family time feel less overwhelming. The experience has also changed how I think about family obligations and relationships in general. I used to see regular contact with family as something that would limit my independence and personal growth. Now I see it more as one of many relationships that requires ongoing effort and attention, like friendships or romantic relationships. I still value my independence and I still need more space than my parents would probably prefer. But I've learned that maintaining connection doesn't have to mean sacrificing autonomy. I can care about my family and stay involved in their lives while still living my own life on my own terms. My dad hasn't pulled any more dramatic stunts, and I don't expect him to. I think he learned his lesson about manipulation being counterproductive. When he wants to express concern or frustration now, he uses words instead of elaborate schemes. It's not always easy to hear, but it's honest and direct, which I can respect. The whole experience taught me that family relationships, like any relationships, require ongoing work and communication. You can't just assume people know how you feel or what you need. You have to be willing to have difficult conversations, to admit when you're wrong, and to make changes when things aren't working. I'm grateful that my family was able to come through this stronger than we were before. Not every family would have been able to work through something like this, and I know we're lucky that everyone was ultimately willing to put in the effort to rebuild trust and communication. So that's where things stand now. My dad learned that you can't manipulate people into loving you the way you want to be loved. I learned that maintaining relationships requires more intentional effort than I was putting in. And my whole family learned that we're capable of working through even the most bizarre and painful situations if we're willing to be honest with each other. It's been a strange journey, but I'm glad we're all still here, really here, not fake funeral, here to continue working on it together.